Okay, so hello and welcome to the History Ledger, the Economic History Society's podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Wallace of the London School of Economics, and I'm joined today by Leigh Gardner, who's also of the LSE, to talk about the economic history of empire. So, Leigh, welcome.
Thank
Um,
you.
could you maybe start by giving us a sense of how it is you actually came to work on this topic, on the economic history of empire yourself?
A little bit by accident. I was interested in states and what happens when you try to build a centralized state. And I got particularly interested in what happens when you try to kind of impose your idea of a state on somewhere else. What then happens locally? How do you fund that state? How is it structured? How does it interact with the political institutions that are there already? And so the case study I came to in looking at that was the British Empire in colonial Africa. And I've kept going from there.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you are kind of very much an African specialist, aren't you, in that sense? You've kind of
Yes.
done so many books on Africa now. It's brilliant. I mean, this is a great basis for us because we're going to concentrate in this series on the long 19th century, which is when so much of the empire in Africa is built out. And we're really talking about the period from the end of the American War of Independence to the First World War. And you are American, aren't you?
I am, yes.
You are. So you're kind of like the bit where the Americans left. We're thinking about the rest. So this is the period that sees the high point of the British Empire. It's when it reaches its biggest geographical extent, and that is simply huge. So what we're going to try and do, particularly in this episode, is really just get a handle on the way that historians, economic historians particularly, have thought about this, to understand what are the big debates, the big questions about the economic history of the British Empire? A lot's been published on this, a lot of different things to read, and we're going to have some guides to further reading in the program notes if you want to take this further. But what we're going to get through, I think, is just some of the big issues. So let's start with the why, the motivation. What is it that's actually driving this expansion of empire? Is it economic reasons? Is it political reasons? Religious reasons? I don't know. And what is it that historians have thought about this?
So I'm going to give the kind of horrible academic answer to this question is that there is no one story you can tell about this. There's lots of different things interacting. One of the things to remember is that the expansion of the British Empire, if we take the whole thing, happened over many centuries. So obviously the motivations and all of that and the structures of it will have changed a lot over that time. Even if you just look at the 19th century, when you have this kind of big expansion of the empire following the American Revolution, you have trade is really important in some places. In other places, political or military or strategic motivations might be more important. In other places, you have kind of movements, still have movements of settlers. This is not as big as it was in the early modern period, but it's still there as an influence. So I think there really isn't one answer because it's not really a sort of coherent project that anyone dreams up, right? It's a sort of set of factors that come together. In 1883, there's a historian called John Seeley who publishes a famous book on the expansion of empire. Seeley was a defender of empire, so he's not very popular today. But he has a famous line about how Britain, in other words, has conquered and peopled half the world in a fit of absence of mind. Basically, this has sort of all happened by accident. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it was a sort of confluence of different factors that played out differently in different regions. So often, if you ask somebody who's a specialist in one region or another, then you might get a slightly different answer about what the driving factors were. So, I mean, I don't want to downplay the role of trade, but lots of trade happened outside the empire. So you don't need an empire to trade. So in the 19th century, the kind of only a couple of Britain's really important imports, things like wool and sugar and timber, those came from empire, but the rest often came mostly from outside the empire. So you didn't require an empire to trade. But trade competition could play a role. So there's some nice work on the scramble for Africa, about how it wasn't so much Britain, but France. So we also have to think about this as a dynamic situation with more than one empire interacting with each other. And Britain could kind of, as the kind of industrial leader at the time, could kind of dominate markets a lot of times without territorial expansion. But other players like France might try to acquire territory or try to kind of keep British interests out. And that drives a kind of self-fulfilling process by which territorial claims were made.
So we shouldn't think then in any way about a single reason,
No.
right? We should think about a mix of different reasons. We should think about where we're studying and expect things to change. I thought it was really interesting what you said, though, that this might be driven by the actions of other nations and a kind of
Mhm.
sense of competition. Is that particularly a story for Africa, you think?
I don't think it's exclusively a story for Africa. I mean, I think it's about the strength of kind of claims being made, right? So if you imagine you're interested in, a particular commodity, you want to guarantee a supply of that. If you might have a set of interest in that region. So you could have things coming from a variety of places, right? So you could have pressures coming from a power that's influential in a neighboring region, and you worry they might come try to take it over. You might also have commercial, and this happened a lot as well, commercial interests, so British commercial interests, merchant firms, whatever, that are involved in that region that somehow get into trouble. This happened quite often, that sort of then call on the British state for help and try to lobby them to kind of send in military resources. That was also could be a driver. So the driver doesn't necessarily have to be someone within the state. It could be the state responding to other things that are going on.
Okay. I mean, is there a place where some of this happens most really clearly? I was just trying to kind of think about where captures this best. I like that idea of kind of like businessmen get in trouble, they call for the navy. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, West Africa is a good example, right? So you have across the kind of scope of the 19th century, the end of the slave trade comes with a lot of political upheaval within West Africa, right? So you have a lot of, by that point, states that had built themselves up and kind of developed a lot of coercive capacity to involve themselves in the slave trade. And the slave trade ends, there's a lot of upheaval in those states. European merchant firms at that point sort of exports of commodities from West Africa. West Africa is not yet under formal colonial rule, but exports of particular commodities have accelerated quite rapidly. So you have people kind of getting involved, and merchants and things try to develop local alliances with people. Sometimes they get the politics of it wrong, and they do send in calls for, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, for the British military to come in. So, into the Ashanti Wars, for example, are one example of where this starts to happen. But
Okay. And the Ashanti Wars, that's now in the country, the area which is now the country of Ghana. Is that
yes,
right?
correct. Yes.
Yeah. So, and at that time, it's the Kingdom of Ashanti. So,
Yes, I mean there's still an Ashanti kingdom within the country of Ghana, which is a
oh, is
more
there really?
complicated story than we need to get into. But yes, yeah.
Okay. So there's no, in that sense, we should be thinking there's no big theory, there's no big debate about kind of empire as a total program of British expansion. And it's really interesting idea that this might be seen as just accident, as different initiatives with no guiding mind, no guiding agenda. Um,
Yeah, no, I think that is the case, that there really isn't one. I mean, I think people have often tried to kind of reconstruct a story in retrospect. So you get various arguments about this, but if you look at the arguments at the time, there's really a lot of different things going on. And it's notable that it's not, there's incentives facing all the sort of European powers, right? Like there were those that kind of started in the sort of empire game, if you like, early, and then there were the kind of newer places like Germany, like Italy, that only unified a bit later. But they also thought, oh, right, okay, everyone else has colonies. I need to kind of get on board with this too. So it's not, I think we shouldn't look for specifically British reasons for something that's a sort of pan-European thing.
yeah. And I think that's a really important point that we are joining empire in. If we join it in the late 18th century, a couple of hundred years, more perhaps even, after the European imperial program has started. So this is very much a kind of a world where quite a lot is already fixed, isn't it? Quite a lot of kind of dominion has been established, particularly in the Americas, but also in India.
Mhm.
Okay, so I mean, if we're thinking, all right, this is an accidental process, um, I think there's probably a bit more debate on this question about who actually benefits. And I think
Mhm.
this is something where I think there's kind of obviously a lot of politics around this in different
Mhm.
countries in Britain, but also in former colonies, former parts of the British
Mhm.
Empire. Um, what are the different viewpoints on how much of a payoff there is from empire for the British economy?
This is one of the sort of lingering questions. I mean, it was a question, very active question at the time, right? I mean, it's important to remember this wasn't a universally popular kind of thing to do with voters at the time. And either in London or any other European capital. And most of the debate at that time came around those questions, right? What is this going to cost us as a country, as a government, if you're sending the Royal Navy off to somewhere, and what are we going to get back as an economy? And usually that was the subject of these kind of very active debates in Parliament, in the press, kind of pretty much everywhere. Since then, there have been attempts to try to do this kind of a bit more systematically. So in the 1980s and 1990s, when kind of computers were first starting to come into economic history research, people tried to kind of do an accounting process of the costs and benefits of empire. And these were really big research efforts. They look pretty basic now in terms of technology, but these were really big efforts at the time. The findings were pretty inconclusive, partly because to do this, you have to try to figure out a counterfactual world in which the empire didn't exist, right? So to try to figure out what costs and what benefits should be attributed to empire, you have to kind of develop some assumptions about what would have happened in the absence of empire. So for example, there are kind of popular estimates recently that talk about all of trade with India as a cost to India and a benefit to the British Empire. But we really think that entrepreneurs anywhere in India would not have traded at all with Britain in the absence of empire. So you can talk about kind of whether the terms of that trade would have been different, but then you have to figure out numbers to assign to that. And it's very, very tricky to do all of that in any very convincing way. So most of the time they don't come to any very definite conclusion. A lot of the times it's sort of like, well, there were some benefits and there were some costs and came out about even, just about, we think, maybe. But it's all very uncertain and it depends a lot on what assumptions you make about what the world would have looked like out without the empire. Because the empire was so big and so complicated, it's really hard to kind of imagine it away because it affects a lot of different things, right?
So this is really interesting. There's a couple of things in what you've said that maybe we can go back to. I
Mhm.
mean, firstly, there's a methodological point about
Mhm.
how on earth we try and measure something as big and
Mhm.
unclear as big as all encompassing as empire. And you talked about counterfactuals there, and counterfactuals are a really important method in economic
Mhm.
history, where, as you said, we imagine what might happen in a different world version of the world where something, in this case, empire, hadn't occurred. And as you say, it's not like we'd have carried on doing the same things anyway. We'd have doing nothing rather. We'd have traded, we'd have done
Mhm.
some form of exchange and production. So it's really hard to measure. And
Mhm.
those counterfactuals, they take a lot of estimates, right? They need a lot of different things to go into them. And when people have been thinking about these early kind of estimates, what kind of things did they put on the costs and the benefits side? Let's dive a little bit deeper in if we can.
Yeah, sure. So on the benefit side, it would be things like often this was measured by, you know, returns earned by, profits earned by companies operating in the empire, right? Were they more profitable because you had policies put in place in the empire that sort of benefited British companies together? This empirically turns out to be kind of complicated. You can get records, but there's an issue with kind of any business history called survivor bias, right? You only have records from the companies that are still around. Usually the ones that fail don't leave papers around for us to find. The other thing is that 19th century accounting practices were not always what we would consider, kind of the best in the world. So, there's an issue of kind of if you find a record of profit and loss, can you, do you believe it? Can you reconstruct it, et cetera? There's things like that. But the survivor bias issue is the really big one, right? How many companies tried to enter empire and failed? We don't really know. And does that, and I think a lot of the kind of business history accounts suggest it was very sort of could be very high risk, high return, but the risk comes with the risk of failure too. On the cost side, this again becomes a little bit of an issue of categorization. Now, you get a progressive process during the 19th century where they try increasingly to kind of separate colonial costs from the sort of main British budget for various reasons, right? But particularly, in the 19th century, this is still ongoing. And if you take something like the cost of the Royal Navy, really big item of expenditure in the annual budget, the Royal Navy kind of goes around the world and it protects kind of, plays a big role in protecting British trade with empire, but also with places that are outside the empire. So how much of that do you put down to the empire being there versus how much of it do you put down to just wanting to be a kind of militarily dominant power and sending ships everywhere? Again, people have made assumptions to try to do that, but those are assumptions you can always kind of argue with. And there's no definite accounting from the period that says this is what we're spending because we have an empire and this is what we would have spent anyway. We don't know. So we have to kind of reverse engineer the process, which is difficult.
Okay, so I mean, in the things you've been talking about there, you've been talking about the profits that businesses make
Mhm.
and the costs that states bear, particularly the military costs and I guess
Mm.
the government costs
Mhm.
of running a country after or running a region after you've made it part of your empire. What about any direct transfers in the form of taxes or impositions of any kind imposed upon countries that are now part of the empire that they wouldn't have paid otherwise, that are now taken to London and then fed back into whatever coffers in Britain are then available for the state that wouldn't have otherwise been the case? Or is this a myth? Is this an idea that doesn't really happen?
So this is an idea that doesn't really happen. You do get not in the kind of very direct way, the way you propose. Not in the There are other empires where it does happen, right? There are examples. They are usually, I think the Dutch cultivation system, there's forced cultivation of rubber, right? That involved pretty massive transfers to the Dutch treasury. But these tend to be pretty short-lived. The Belgian Congo is another one, right? But these tend to be pretty short-lived because they tend to come with the kind of long-term costs of people tend to protest. And anytime you have to kind of put down a protest, it's massively expensive, right? So they did a lot to try to avoid promoting kind of or anything that would kind of trigger a lot of violence within the colonies themselves. So part of this process I talked about where finances are separated is that you would have taxes raised within the colonies, but they were essentially spent within the colonies. So they were there to fund the kind of annual expenditure of each colony. Now, some of that you can argue is not exactly, I mean, one example is they went to pay the salaries of colonial officials. So British officials sent to the colonies. They were paid a lot of money in local terms, right? Their salaries were set according to kind of British civil service salaries, not according to local per capita incomes, which are usually much lower. So that, in a way, is a thing people wouldn't have paid for that sort of level of official salary if not for empire. But it's not a direct transfer to London itself, right?
Okay. So it's like an
Um,
expensive local government.
yeah, exactly. It's
Okay.
very
We've got
expensive
these
local government.
foreigners, they've come in, they're demanding a bit more money, but I guess in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty small in terms of the differences of tax that people would be paying
Yeah.
for
I
this.
mean, I think that the evidence we have on comparative levels of taxations is pretty low, right? Which is kind of what you'd expect given low per capita incomes in colonies anyway, right? Just the available surplus to be taxed isn't huge. But also this kind of wariness, these are very understaffed administrations. They don't have a lot of people. They don't have a lot of knowledge of the people they're governing, including what their incomes are, how to tax them. In most colonies, these are agricultural producers, a very hard group to tax even today because we don't really have a good idea of what their surplus is. It's not always in cash, that kind of thing. So the amount of tax they could get out, and again, they had this issue of trying to avoid promoting tax revolts, which did happen when they kind of overstepped, right, and did cost a lot more than they could possibly collect in return.
Yeah, so I guess in my mind, I had this vision of almost the Spanish Empire and flotillas of silver crossing crossing the Atlantic. But so by the 19th century, at least in the British Empire, there's not really an equivalent of that kind of resource extraction or rent extraction from what you're saying. And I guess that makes sense. These are relatively poor parts of the world, which is one reason why Britain's able to bring them into its imperial
Exactly.
network, imperial state. So we've got maybe an expensive state. We haven't got big transfers, and we've got some profits of business people, but we're just not really sure if they're much bigger than they would have been otherwise.
Hmm.
Um, ah, it's a pretty boring ledger, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah. And one subject to a lot of interpretation and a lot of assumption. The other place where you can see that people talk about with the ledger is Britain becomes a very big exporter of capital, right? Foreign investment is a big thing. And a lot of that, not the majority, but a large chunk of that foreign investment goes to the empire. The empire is pretty dependent on um, London being a big financial capital. So the governance of the empire kind of builds itself around that in a lot of ways. And so they put in a lot of institutional incentives for investment to go to the colonies. So the problem with the rates of return on colonial investments were lower than you might get if you invested in, say, Argentina or something, right? So there's some argument that actually those things, there's a sort of misallocation of capital into things with lower rates of return than you might have done in the absence of empire. People might have said, okay, well, that's a much more efficient way of using my money is to send it to somewhere else where it's higher risk but higher return. You would have gotten something else back. So.
oh, that's really interesting. So some of these investments are literally just not as good as you could have got in the absence of empire. But
I mean,
but
they're
you
more,
say safer. Yeah.
again, they're safer. Yeah, exactly. But there might have been higher return ways you could have used the money or kind of, yeah, than in investing in a particular colony. So there's some, again, this is hard to prove because you don't know what people would have done in the absence of empire, if they would have invested as much abroad, if like, you don't know the counterfactual again, but.
All right. So I mean, I'm going to carry on building out this cave of my own ignorance, I suppose. But I mean, we talked there about direct transfers.
Mm,
I've heard people arguing that this is about accessing markets that business
mm,
people wouldn't have been able to access before. Maybe even protecting those markets against other competitors. So, okay, we've got a lot of cotton shirts to sell. Where are we going to sell them? Well, this is what the empire's for. It's a way to kind of provide protected markets for the things that we're making in Britain by the 19th century in ever larger quantities as the result of the Industrial Revolution. Is there any kind of mileage in that type of argument that this gives British exporters a kind of like special protected place where they can sell for a better profit perhaps than they would have otherwise?
Potentially, this is something that changes over time. So, I mean, this is the case with a lot of things when you talk about empire because it's over such a long span of history. There's not one answer over the space. So, earlier in the 19th century, when Britain's kind of undisputed industrial leader, right, it doesn't necessarily need the empire. This is why it trades quite a lot with people outside imperial walls and why you have this kind of theory of informal imperialism that's really about the fact that it's just the dominant producer and kind of dominant source of capital that kind of is used to influence this anyway, right? Once you start to get to a point where, Britain is sort of not as competitive, once you start to get the later 19th century into the 20th century, particularly in the interwar period, then this becomes a bit more kind of salient, right? The access to empire and empire's markets. Potentially, they do try to strengthen the relationship with the empire to try to kind of safeguard those markets. Now, other people's, I mentioned the example of France earlier, right? Other kind of less competitive countries' efforts to keep the British out might have also driven the expansion of the British Empire. So there's a kind of dynamic process here. But it did shape kind of the access of British manufacturers to markets. Again, there's some argument that that might have, in the long run, been a bad thing, in the sense that if you have this sort of easy access to markets that you know are protected from other people, you don't engage in the kind of competition and therefore don't innovate as much, which may have contributed to exacerbating the relative decline, right? Why innovate if you can just sell things under a sort of tariff wall, not worry about it?
That's really interesting. So, I mean, I guess this goes back to the kind of like earlier discussion we were having about whether it's worth it or not. But it, it wasn't necessary when Britain was highly competitive.
Mm,
And when it became useful, in some ways, it was perhaps a problematic set of incentives because it allowed British manufacturers to remain less productive, less competitive than they might have otherwise have been forced to be by the disciplines of the market itself.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, we're not kind of finding a very strong case for the benefits of the economic payoff from empire here, right? A motivation
Mm.
payoff. Um, I mean, in that sense, how do we think about this in terms of British economic growth? I mean, is this essentially marginal? I'm getting the sense that it's not going to be super important from what you're saying. Um, does it contribute much to British economic growth of the 19th century? Is it a problem, maybe?
I mean, this is again really hard to say because of the counterfactual question, right? And because you can't, it's very hard sometimes to see exactly what's coming from empire and what isn't. I mean, certainly British economic growth facilitates the expansion of the empire. This is the other difficulty, right? The relationship goes both directions. Is that you have, economic leadership, which allows Britain to acquire the empire that it does in the first place. And then what role that empire plays afterwards then does reflect kind of changing fates of the British economy. So, I mean, you can point to periods where it is really important, right? Where access to those resources, again, during periods of downturn, particularly during the two world wars, and it's getting beyond the 19th century. But in those periods, then having access to sort of personnel and sort of resources of the empire was pretty crucial, right, to the British war effort, both in terms of raw material and just manpower and all the rest of it. Um, so I think it's difficult to kind of tell a causal story about kind of empire and British economic growth. It there are things on kind of both sides of the ledger, if you will, that might contradict each other and things that changed over the long period we're talking about.
Okay. So, um, at the very least, it'll be really hard to say in the 19th century
Mm.
that there's a strong case for seeing empire as a major driver of growth.
Yes,
And
I think
I mean,
so.
I think that the kind of point is really interesting that in the First World War, maybe
Mm.
later in the 20th century, it becomes really important as a source of resources at a
Mhm.
time when you're constrained because of warfare. But yeah, that kind of point about the difficulty of distinguishing between empire and other markets being just deeply, deeply problematic in the 19th century makes a lot of sense to me, right?
Mm.
Uh, we have other markets that are closer than India or Africa to British ports, Europe particularly. All right, so let's turn to the kind of consequences for countries that are within an empire. I mean, you mentioned kind of obviously the kind of some of the burdens of having these states potentially. We've talked about some of the kind of um, limits that we have in trying to estimate how much trade or exchange they might have done, they might have carried out with Europe, with Britain or other ports already. But I mean, there are at least a set of views that suggest that economic development in terms of expanding manufacturing or maybe even losing manufacturing in the case of India um, might have been a consequence of being part of the empire. And people talk about systems where there's a kind of core country
Mm.
and then various colonial or imperial subject states that are essentially sources of raw materials, sources of cheap agricultural labor, and not really allowed to develop. I mean, do you think that's got much support nowadays, that type of position?
I mean, I think certainly the economic policies of the empire definitely prioritized the sort of rapid expansion of commodity exports and nothing else, right? Like that's very clear. This was part of the kind of financial structure in the sense that the colonial states had to build a tax base relatively quickly. The easiest way to do that was to try to promote foreign trade because that's the easiest thing to tax in a way. And the kind of yeah usual way of doing that was to try to kind of promote the production of some kind of export to invest in the infrastructure or whatever the kind of block
What
was of kind of
what kind of things are we talking about here when we're talking about imperial commodity exports?
Um, so a variety of things. So if I go back to the West Africa example again, palm oil was a big one in the 19th century. So this was something that was kind of used as palm oil. It's literally the oil that comes from a seed from a palm tree. And it has been can be used as food, still is eaten in a large part of the world. If you look at any processed item you have, you'll see it usually contains palm oil. Um,
Yeah, it's,
that's
it's
why it's
controversial at the moment, right? Because they're
yes, yeah,
clearing
exactly, right.
plantations for
Yeah.
palm oil cultivation.
Exactly. But it's used indigenously as well. So if you go to markets in West Africa, you see it used quite a lot in food production. But it's also in the 19th century becomes increasingly in demand as an industrial lubricant, as an ingredient in soap. Same thing can be said for groundnuts, otherwise known as peanuts. You also have new commodities coming on stream. The big success story in West Africa is cocoa, which is actually a plant indigenous to the Americas, but gets imported to first to the sort of islands off the West African coast in the early in the 19th century, and then into Nigeria and Ghana, and sort of that region. A little bit later on, Ghana, within about a decade, becomes the world's largest producer of cocoa. So it grows very, very quickly, in part due to some of these investments, right? So you have the expansion of some of these commodity exports prior to empire. It's not entirely down to empire. Indigenous entrepreneurs are very ready to kind of jump on opportunities that are there. But transport costs in West Africa are very high. And what you need to overcome that in the 19th century is a railway, essentially. And railways require a lot of capital, and that kind of is where the empire comes in, right? So colonial governments had better access to capital than independent governments. They were able to construct these things, and that allowed export production to spread into new regions where it hadn't really been viable before.
So is it mainly internal communications then that that are being improved in these West African states to
Yeah.
make this possible?
Yeah, so it's, I mean, it's the construction of the railways. So we have quite good research on this now that shows that the railways had a really big impact on the economic geography of the regions because they had just such a big impact on transport costs. You have a lot of, well, West Africa as well, other parts of Africa. You have sleeping sickness is endemic. You can't have transport. You can't have like transport by animals, large animals, because they die of sleeping sickness.
Hmm.
So it means your alternative, if you don't have railways or roads, or human transports, people literally carrying things on their heads.
Yes, doesn't sound
Which
hugely efficient, right, relative to a
no,
railway.
humans are good at many things. Carrying things is not one of them. We're not very strong, and we can't do very much of it. But
I feel that every day. I mean, we've got this kind of shift to commodities. I mean, who's producing this stuff, though, right? I mean, is this indigenous farmers or so these aren't kind of giant plantations being created in.
so these not European plantations are indigenous run plantations, particularly for palm oil. There's some quite large ones that are indigenous owned and indigenous established or African run. And yeah, so the cocoa farms, I mean, it's known as a smallholder crop, and it's a little bit misleading. Some of those farms could be quite large, but it was not European production. It was entirely indigenous led.
Okay, so this is quite an interesting kind of example then of the
Mhm.
types of opportunity that, in this case, imperial capital investment could bring into a country. Um,
Yeah, and people
d-
were very ready to respond to that if they were in the right region and set up the right way. Now, the benefits to this were very unevenly distributed, which is another issue we could talk about. But there were definitely winners from this process within colonies as well.
okay, and that's within the indigenous population, the
Yes.
local Ghanaian, African, Ashanti,
Yes.
whatever
Yeah.
where we're talking about is identified as at the time. Um, in this case, I'm there. I'm farming cocoa, putting it on this new railway that's appeared. Is there then still a fully competitive market at the port? Am I able to sell it for the best price, or is there any kind of there's no kind of imperial attempt to control the exports?
Um, there are some, I mean, there's two things that you can look at. And again, it's very hard to measure the impacts of this, but the export of cocoa is dominated by British merchant firms. So once you get to the port, internally, it's primarily an indigenous enterprise in terms of both growing it, but also kind of aggregating it and moving it to the port. Once you get to the port, this is dominated by British merchant firms. There were a lot of arguments among cocoa producers at the time that those merchant firms colluded to keep prices down. These often came at a time when cocoa prices globally were down anyway, so it's a little bit hard to know kind of how much of this was the firms and how much of it was just the fact that prices were declining. But it did result in some pretty well organized kind of protests, sort of cocoa holdups where people would withhold their crop to try to get the prices to go back up and some interesting attempts to kind of take an end run around the British merchant firms by selling directly to the US or to somewhere else to get out of that system. The other thing that comes in, we're getting beyond the 19th century now, but the other thing that comes in the interwar period is they start to introduce marketing boards. So these are a response initially to us as a sort of official place that's run by the government where you have to sell your cocoa to the marketing board. The idea here is that you can stabilize the price that way. So this is a period, during World War I and during the interwar period, you have a lot of price volatility, which is very difficult for farmers to kind of cope with. Cocoa is a tree crop. It takes 3 years for a cocoa tree to actually produce anything. So you have to do a lot of advanced planning, which is very hard when the prices are fluctuating. So the idea is you have an official price. You can use the proceeds when the global price is higher than that official price to kind of compensate when the price is lower, right? That's the idea. But you can see it's very easy for people to then use the official price to make it a sort of de facto tax, which eventually becomes the case kind of later in the colonial period and in the post-independence periods. Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, newly independent Ghana, used that quite to tax the cocoa farmers quite aggressively. So
Okay.
there are some government controls in there, but for the most part, yeah, they were able to export.
And this is I guess, one of the big differences between countries that are linked into the empire or regions that are subject to imperial control and settler colonies, such as South Africa
Yeah.
or North America, parts of North America, Canada, Australia, where it's a really different kind of economy.
Yeah, no, certainly if you look at settler economies where the emphasis, where you have a certain, very influential group, usually politically, it was very possible for state policy to kind of favor the interests of those, usually by kind of depressing labor prices, right? So depressing wages, either by kind of coercing people in some ways or restricting their outside options. This is what happens in South Africa for sure.
Okay, but in the non-settler colonies in Africa, this is something that's just not really viable, I guess, by the sound of it. That
I mean, there are various attempts to kind of coerce people into producing things or coerce them into producing more of them, but they didn't tend to either last very long or work very well. Partly because the colonial states again are very understaffed. They're quite under-resourced. They're quite reliant on indigenous intermediaries to do a lot of the on-the-ground kind of governing for them. So it's very hard in that context to force people to do things like grow cotton. There's a lot of attempts to have people grow cotton in various places, but cotton is actually very hard to produce. It's a lot of labor. It doesn't grow well alongside other things, so you can't kind of crop it alongside food in a lot of places that easily. It's very demanding on the soil, etc. So people didn't like it, and so they often just wouldn't do it. But
okay, so I mean, the vision here, or the sense we're getting here is of actually a really thin empire that's just not able to do that much to reshape the economies of the regions and countries it's absorbed, unless there are settlers who are more providing a kind of like takeover
mm,
manpower essentially to who are seeking to exploit different settings. And so there's a kind of mix of there's a real mix of outcomes in that sense that investment in
exactly.
railways, investment in connectivity can be a boon for the people of the area in providing greater access. But there can also be some problems with this as well.
Yeah, for some people. I mean, it's worth saying that particularly this is pretty true everywhere, but particularly in Africa, the railway networks are really thin. Ralph Austin, who is a kind of legendary African economic historian, describes them as being dendritic. It's a bit like the lines on a leaf. You know, you have one line going up and then maybe a couple of it, but like a lot of people wouldn't really been within reach of the railway. So it's really infrastructure that kind of serves one particular purpose. So the kind
Mm.
of broad-based development impacts you often get with infrastructure aren't really there because it's really just there to kind of get the commodities out and get stuff in rather than the other way around.
Okay, so and it's in that sense, it's about linking them to ports, isn't it? Really.
Yes, yeah. So
So
it's
this,
linking export areas to ports. Or sometimes, I mean, you sometimes get unintended consequences. So in northern Nigeria, they built a set of railways primarily for military reasons. They weren't really for, but this suddenly people discovered, oh, you can grow groundnuts here and export them. And these were Africans making this discovery. This was not a project of the colonial state, but African farmers thought, oh, this is great. So it ends up being one of northern Nigeria's leading exports, kind of by accident. But
that's a really interesting counter example. So in this sense, like the economic history of empire is it's a really complicated picture, as I see it from what you said. The process of building an empire is really accidental. There's not really a governing kind of plan. There's not a project. There's a lot of different reasons to different places. It's really hard to know who it pays off for, whether it pays off for Britain at all, because of this difficulty of estimating costs and benefits. And it's also quite difficult to see whether or not this is actually something that drives change and economic growth in Britain or not. It could be as much a cost as it could be a benefit, particularly in providing the access to kind of more protected markets allow you to remain relatively uncompetitive. Um, I think there's also something a little bit optimistic at the end there in terms of the ways in which we think about empire playing out in some of the countries and regions that get drawn within empire. And we've talked a little bit there about Ghana. It's like
mm.
core area that we love. And it's got quite an interesting mix there of benefits being shared in parts, as I take your story, between local farmers and imperial merchants.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly get indigenous producers who benefit, and that happens kind of across the board, even in settler colonies. You do get this. You also, though, I mean, it's worth kind of bearing in mind the sort of other side of the balance sheet from the colony's perspective is it's only certain regions. What I mean about the networks being thin, right? If you're near a railway, if you're near a railway in an area where it's good for producing exports, then you probably do gain. And it is that export production is a source of upward mobility for a lot of producers. But there's also the kind of flip side to that is there are areas that are outside that region, right? So if you talk about northern Ghana, right, which is outside the kind of reach of the railway, isn't really good for growing cocoa. It becomes a labor reserve economy or kind of labor reserve for the cocoa farms. And there you do see a decline in living standards, whereas you see a kind of increase in the cocoa areas. So for the places where we can get enough data on this, one of the things you see through the colonial period is rising inequality within the indigenous population. And that has, depending on how it's kind of how it develops, often has some political implications after independence, or sort of how politically coherent it's possible to kind of make these new countries and things like that. So there's negative sides too, as well. And I think also the focus on that sort of commodity growth. I mean, you mentioned earlier the kind of difference between growth and development. You have growth here for sure, and you have some people who benefited from the growth. But colonial states did not do anything to sort of promote development of human capital, or kind of there was some provision of schooling, mostly by missionaries and things like that, but there wasn't really much of an emphasis by the colonial state across any of the empire, and they didn't tend to invest much in kind of economic diversification, the kinds of things that lead you historically for kind of sustained improvements in per capita income.
So
So what
these
you
are
get is this pattern of kind of boom and bust that kind of follows the commodity price. These sort of economies that are very much oriented around a small number of exports, which can be a very unstable and sort of precarious place to be.
Yeah, so these are really important points to bring into the discussion, aren't they? I mean, if we think about this as we've been talking about it, it's very much a focus on trade, it's a focus on commodities. But if we
Mm,
think about education, if we think about the build out of manufacturing, of services, that's left out of this discussion so far,
mhm.
right? Um, if we were to think, blah, blah, blah. Can't always think coherently at any point in time. Um, can you explain just, can we just take you back a moment? You used the phrase labor surplus, labor reserve. You talked
Mhm.
about labor reserve. Can you just explain what a labor reserve area is?
So labor reserves is a place where the sort of primary economic activity, or sort of beyond subsistence, is sending labor somewhere else, right? Like the labor, the value of that labor is greater if you send them to a different area. So, or usually this comes in the form of migration, right? And this can kind of just happen based on factor endowments. Northern Ghana example. I mean, it's pretty arid in northern Ghana. And then the Gold Coast, and the sort of labor demands of cocoa, implies much more profit from kind of going and working for wages there, than staying home and producing for subsistence, within where you're from. It can also be done artificially, right? In settler economies, where there was an effort to supply cheap labor to settler enterprises, whether that's mines in South Africa, or farms or whatever else. Then you can do this by essentially restricting the amount of land available to indigenous producers to make sure people had to kind of go find waged employment elsewhere because there wasn't enough opportunity, kind of deliberately so, within where they were living. And
Okay,
this
so
can have, oh, sorry, no.
no, it's all right. I was just holding it clear in my mind. So these are areas where there's not really enough work for the population, and they have therefore to go and work in areas that are more distant, where they're, in
Yeah,
this case, part of the cocoa farms or the plantations or whatever.
yeah. And this can have kind of a lot of implications for kind of, how domestic farming is organized, a lot of implications for gender, and kind of women's roles. So women become kind of, whereas previously, if you imagine a kind of subsistence farming household, you would have a kind of gender split of agricultural tasks. If the man is then going off to work on a cocoa farm for 6 months of the year, going off to work in a mine for 6 months of the year, or more than that even, then more of that burden kind of falls on to the remaining household members who are there, which affects other things. So there's really interesting work about kind of, how this plays out is very different locally, in every place, but there's some really interesting work on how that impacts different parts, or different types of people. That
Okay. So
makes sense. But
no, I think that makes great sense. It's really interesting to think about how these economies are transformed by these kind of developments that are made possible in part through empire. And they can have these quite different effects on the regions that are thriving, maybe regions that are left behind. And the idea that this then generates new patterns of inequality, creates groups who are relatively well off, who previously were not so well off, and then that's politically challenging, as you
Mhm.
say. And obviously, I mean, in this kind of ledger, this kind of list of the pros and cons economically of empire for both Britain and the countries within empire, we aren't really talking about political rights. We aren't
Mm.
talking about other kinds of freedoms that may also be suppressed within this. So we're deliberately kind of limiting the bounds of the conversation to the economics. Well, that's our job, right? And I think that makes it kind of really interesting to think that this then is a system where economically it can look okay, but it's
Mm.
not necessarily laying the groundwork for future development because it's not building out the education. It's not laying the ground for what you might think of as a modern economy where
Mm.
much more work is done in manufacturing and services. And obviously, it can be creating problems for the political structures of those countries as they become independent later on.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. Okay. I think we've covered our four main areas of discussion
Yeah.
today, which is great. Um, so thank you, Leigh. That's been really interesting.
Thank you.
I think we've got a real sense now of some of the kind of complexities of empire and the economic history of empire. And we're going to talk a lot more about this over the rest of the series. So thank you very much for joining me here today. It's been really great to get your insights into how the empire worked. Thank you.
Thank you.